Hello and welcome to the season 1 finale of the Unofficial Gilded Age After Show. We are so excited to be here. It's been an exciting, fun 9 weeks, and we have finally arrived at the end of our first season. I am Kelsie Paul. I am the manager of interpretation and engagement at the Frick Pittsburgh. Today, I am joined by two familiar faces. I have Melanie Groves here with me, who is our manager of exhibitions and registrar at the Frick. And then we also have Alonna Carter back with us. She is the Frick's Burke Family Fellow. She is a public historian, research extraordinaire. And so the three of us are going to get into this final episode. There's lots to talk about as always, and we will start with our episode synopsis. So in episode 9, Let the Tournament Begin, Marion's grand plan is threatened. Bertha and Mrs. Astor lock horns over Gladys's debut, and Peggy is stunned by a major reveal. We're going to talk about all of those things and much more. Let's start at the top with Tom and Marion. So much to unpack here with Tom and Marion. Maybe not so much from a history perspective, but it's still worth talking about. I will admit that my theory was wrong. I was not correct about my theory about his long con, but I would like to point out that Melanie said my story would have been more interesting.
It absolutely would have been more interesting. This was the most disappointing storyline. Average, normal, like not what I was expecting to happen. Just
not
like
what I was expecting. No, it was far less interesting than I think we were led to believe it was going to be. Alana, you pointed out that we should have all at least seen it coming with the last name that they chose for this character.
Right.
For those of us who maybe are not familiar with the term rake as a description for a man, what exactly does that mean?
So a rake is someone who kind of it has varying definitions. It can be a con man. It could be somebody in high society who's, a drunk or a gambler. So if we kind of look at Tom Rake's character, I mean, he kind of gambled on high society. So
there you go. That's a good connection.
Yeah, so there you have it, Tom Rakes.
Yeah, there's often a womanizing element to being a rake. If there are any Bridgerton fans out there, one of the main characters from season 1 was often referred to as a rake. So yeah, I think a lot of us saw this coming, though not quite in as lackluster or anticlimactic as a fashion as it ended up being. I think we thought that Tom was going to have some really serious kind of ulterior motives. But in the end, he just sort of changed his mind and decided that it wasn't enough. The sparkle and the glamour and the wealth of New York was just too much for him to give up for Marion. And I mean, Melanie, you were talking in the last episode, like nothing about him wanting to marry her ever really made sense, like in terms of his motivations. And I think we saw that here in the way that it just sort of kind of fell apart at the end.
Yeah. His insistence that they run away and elope so quickly, not telling Aunt Agnes the whole lead up to she'll adjust to it later. Right. I just felt, I guess I felt like he was somehow being honest in his feelings and intentions, because what reason did he have? And I guess maybe he was. And then typical storyline, I guess, like not surprising, just like, love isn't enough. Marion says love just isn't enough. He loves the money and the glamour and the glitz more, and just decided not to show. Just income.
Yeah, I think to me the most surprising thing was the moment at the opera that, the night before he supposedly is going to go elope with Marion, he's just at the opera with Sissy Bingham, where I think he should have been smart enough to know that potentially someone would see him there and that would get back to Marion. He knows Aurora. You would think that he would have looked over and seen like Aurora is sitting there. She's Marion's cousin. Like that didn't really make sense. That felt like it was falling apart a little bit. let's talk a little bit about some truth that is built into that storyline, which is the Flagglers. We've heard about the Flagglers before, and it gets brought back up again. The character Sissy Bingham, as far as I can tell, was not a real person. Perhaps she was a distant relative of the Flagglers that I haven't been able to find proof of her existence. But Henry Flagler was a real person. He was one of these wealthy industrialists, like a Henry Clay Frick or a John D. Rockefeller. He made his money in Standard Oil, which was the Rockefeller company. For those of you who are not familiar, Standard Oil is essentially the origin of ExxonMobil. There is a direct through line to our modern oil companies. But Henry Flagler makes his money in oil, eventually decides that he wants to be a luxury hotel owner. He loves Florida. He falls in love with Florida. He goes down to Florida and builds many luxury hotels that are still there. And his house is also now a museum, the Flagler Museum in Palm Beach, Florida. You can go see his vacation home, Whitehall. So there's a little bit, like as with all things in the Gilded Age show, there's always like a little bit of a nugget of historical truth into Tom's storyline with Marion. But we, I think, have all decided now that we fully are on Team Larry. We are coining the relationship name right now. It is Larian. We are Team Larian. And I'm excited. Obviously, I think that's what was set up for us for season 2. And I'm excited to see where that relationship potentially could go. We see Larry even step in this episode to be important to Marion. So I hope she sees that for what it is. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, I definitely think she does. Even as, there's that scene towards the end where, Rakes comes and approaches Marion and sends her into tears at the ball.
Yeah.
And Larry, he's just kind of like hanging in the background waiting for his moment, and he does it in such a gentlemanly way. It's not like a push. He didn't even like really ask her what was wrong. It was just like, here, come on, let's go have fun, So I am Team Larian all the way. I can't wait to see how their relationship develops. And the actor, he played Drake Karn on the PBS series Poldark, so I'm already a fan of him anyway.
Okay. There you go. I was gonna say I don't recognize him from anything else, but I will have to check that out now because I'm a big fan of him. I mean, everybody who's gone through a breakup and sees their ex in public needs a Larry to sweep in and kind of make them feel better. Especially when you break up and then I think less than 6 hours later you're standing at a party with them, which I think most of us would never want to be in that situation. But yeah, I'm excited to see where that storyline I think could potentially go. We did have another really great moment with Larry, which, when we were speaking yesterday, we felt sort of spoke to an undercurrent or an under theme in the episode, which is this idea of possibility. We've talked in previous episodes about the Gilded Age in general being a time of great change, but a time of great possibility. There was a sort of redefinition, I think, in some ways of what the American dream could look like in the Gilded Age. And we saw some really interesting moments that's built in. One of them is Larry's conversation with George in the carriage, where he brings up the fact that Marion supports him in his efforts to be an architect. And he has this great line where he basically just says something to the effect of, this is a great city. It's a great time to be alive and I want to be a part of it, which I think speaks to the whole theme of the show in a way. But Alonna, I know you pointed out that Chef Bourdon, or Borden, I guess we should call him by his American name, his Kansas name, he kind of represents that too. Like this idea that you can rise up and make something of yourself. He was an interesting plot line that I wasn't expecting in this episode.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I loved him so much. Yeah, he is this example of somebody who, seizes the opportunity to be in this new society at any cost, really. And when we're looking at people, in terms of endless possibilities, they're literally clamoring to be part of this new society in any way that they can. It doesn't matter whether or not they're, cooking for the elite, or they're dining with the elite, or, they're just, there to witness, them in all their finery. You see that over and over again, and including with Jack and Bridget at the end, where Jack, pretty much says, look at them, that could be us one day.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I love it. And I love the fact that this episode was kind of like this, it was a follow-up to the previous episode where they, got a chance to see the Edison, kind of light up,
Yeah.
Light up the world pretty
Right.
much. And so this represents, like, it kind of puts me in the mind of like a theme of a new light going forward into the future. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what I took from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Melanie, do you have any thoughts on Chef Borden?
I do. I love him because I compared him to Bertha. He's found a way to transform himself and move up in the world. Certainly he's making more money as a French chef than he would as a chef from Wichita. But he's really found a scrappy way. And we talked about the fact that there were private eyes, but you're not necessarily checking up. You can't check his Facebook and see where he's been. You'd be able to make that happen. You'd be able to make that change at that point in time a little bit easier than somebody could just change their identity today.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of reinvention there's a whole lot of possibility in a time period where you're right, there's no social media, there aren't even things like driver's licenses for people to like run a background check on you. I mean, there's none of that. So this idea that this man who sounds like had kind of a rough childhood or a rougher background went off to Europe, found his passion for cooking, made something of himself, and then decided to come back. We've talked about the fact that there was a premium on French cuisine. There's a premium on French chefs. That's a status symbol in and of itself in this society. So that was a really shrewd choice for him to make, realizing I'm going to be more marketable if I'm Chef Bourdon rather than Chef Borden from Wichita, Kansas. I do love that scene, that like just little comical scene between the staff in the Russell kitchen when he finally admits the truth of what the letter says. And I think it's Gladys's lady's maid kind of asks him like, why are you still talking with a French accent? And that initial drop of the accent when he just says absolutely, like it's just, he leans so hard into the Middle Western, as Bertha calls it, which as a fellow Middle Westerner, I appreciate his Midwest accent. But yeah, I think that I'm glad that he came back at the end. I hope that this isn't the last that we see of him, but there's also some historical truth to Bertha's concerns about his origins coming out, because the cuisine at her party and her ball would have absolutely been part of the conversation and would have been covered in the press. We're going to talk about the real life inspiration for Bertha's ball in a second, but I've been spending a lot of time looking at press coverings of balls like this, and the press covered in excruciating detail. I mean, everything from the flowers to the food to the music to the dances. And I read many articles that specifically called out the use of a French chef. So, I mean, she's correct that people are going to be scrutinizing that. But I love the conclusion that they kind of come to at the end, where it's like, well, he's from Kansas and he cooked really well, so we're going to be okay with it. But yeah, that was a fun little kind of like B plot. Let's talk about the ball, though, because, of course, this is what we have been building to for 9 episodes. Gladys finally getting her moment, but really, as we talked about, it's really more Bertha's moment than anything else. But this is the inspired story of a true event, really. I mean, the story of Bertha's ball and the showdown that she has with Mrs. Astor is really ripped from the history books. We've talked about the fact that Bertha is, very loosely, based on Alva Vanderbilt. And Alva Vanderbilt did host a costume ball in 1883. We've actually talked about this ball already on the after show when we had Rebecca Kelly with us. We talked about the costume ball where her sister-in-law Alice shows up as the electric light costume. But that was the impetus for this showdown between Alva Vanderbilt and Mrs. Astor. So we have Bertha stepping into that role. Melanie, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of what happened there and what the truth that we're seeing in the storyline between Mrs. Astor and Bertha?
Yeah, so the story that has come down through the press and how much of it is true exactly, I don't know that we will ever be sure, but was essentially that Carrie was practicing the quadrille. She was going to perform the quadrille for Mrs. Vanderbilt's ball.
Yeah.
I'm going to say Mrs. Astor, and I'm about to say Mrs. Astor, but she was practicing. There were I think 6 quadrilles that were performed at Alva's fancy dress ball, and Carrie was included in one. And towards the date of the ball, she realized there were 1,200 invitations to this ball that were sent out to all of New York society, to everyone except the Astors, yes. Who were excluded because Mrs. Astor had never called on Alva and had never received her. And technically it would have been inappropriate to have her daughter performing at the ball anyway. But she really used that to her advantage as a poker chip, if we're thinking about rates and gambling on society. But used that and sort of put Carrie against her mother in wanting to attend this ball, which was going to be and was the most talked about society event of Gilded Age New York, probably to this day. Yeah. We have been going through the albums. One of the albums, or a portion of the album, is preserved in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York. You can see images. They're amazing, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. But Carrie wanted to be there, and that end, she convinced her mother to finally give in, and she did not call on Alva Vanderbilt in person, but she did send a card. And upon receiving the card, then those 2 final invitations made their way out to the Astors, and Carrie attended the ball. I'm not certain, I can't remember. I don't think Mrs. Astor did attend the ball.
From what I read, I think she did. I think she and Carrie both were there. But it's interesting to hear you talk about the fact that like Alva Vanderbilt's bar was lower than what Bertha's bar was. Like Bertha threw down the gauntlet and was not going to settle. You know, you have that great scene where they're basically negotiating the terms of this armistice in a way. Like, you know, like that they're, you know, Bertha says, I will settle for nothing less than you publicly telling people that you came to call today and encouraging them then to come to my ball. That's the only way that this is going to go down. And, you know, you see Mrs. Astor counter offer and say, well, you know, I'm here. Is that not enough? You know, and that back and forth. But I love what you said, Melanie, about the fact that, you know, Bertha or Alva, you know, as a stand-in for Alva, they were right. Like due to these stringent society regulations, due to these rules that Mrs. Astor herself is in large part responsible for putting in place, she couldn't be invited. And so it's funny, we've talked a lot about the fact that Bertha maybe doesn't always know the rules as she's playing this game, but you can see in that moment, she's learned how to play the game. Mm-hmm. And I love that. I love that moment, just the 2 of them. I feel like we've been waiting for it all season.
Yeah, and then ultimately after this party, the Vanderbilts were accepted into society. This was their avenue in. So
right, which is why now, you know, we all talk about Vanderbilt in the same breath with Rockefeller and Astor, and, you know, and in some ways the Vanderbilts and the people like them are the more well-known people in history than, you know, those really old family Knickerbocker families like the Schermerhorns or, you know, things like that. You know, those maybe are not quite as recognizable. I want to talk a little bit about the costumes and the fashion for sure. But let's start by talking about the quadrilles. a little bit because they're a fun thing to include. I've gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole on quadrilles. They were a traditional dance that was done, a group dance essentially, you know, for this period. There were handbooks and music books, and you know, you had to learn the very specific steps, but there's all sorts of different types of quadrilles that you had to learn. Again, we see this very unusual choice with paper, I guess they're paper mache, horse heads on Gladys's quadrille, but that too is also based in reality, though I think that the real story is a little crazier. Gladys's, they just were heads. At Mrs. Vanderbilt's ball, these were full on, like full size play horses, hobby horses that they were dancing around with, like on wheels. I guess they were on wheels. I don't know. And that was just one. That was, you know, there were six quadrilles that they did. So there is truth to that, which is something. But let's talk about the costumes, because Mrs. Russell's ball is not a costume ball per se, though we do see Gladys dressed up in sort of her, you know, 18th century Marie Antoinette getup. But we have spent some time looking at the costume balls because Mrs. Vanderbilt's ball was a costume ball. Melanie, tell us a little bit about how you came across this collection and what our viewers will have the treat of seeing if they seek this out.
Yes, we will include the link to this collection in the show notes, but I think I was introduced to the ball just through general Gilded Age research and the electric light dress, which we've talked about. I think that is the most famous, notwithstanding the fact that it has an extant costume that was included in an exhibition that was done by the Museum of the City of New York. One of my favorite costumes from the night, and one of the ones that gets talked about the most and was most shocking, was a woman who came dressed as a cat. I think her nickname was Puss. Yes. And she's wearing a costume. The gown, the skirt of the dress is covered in white cattails. I can't do it justice. So I'm going to read to you the New York Times description of the outfit, and we'll take a look at the costume. But
yes, please do.
The New York Times says one of the most striking costumes was worn by a well-known young lady who represented a cat. The overskirt was made entirely from white cat's tails sewn on a dark background. The bodice was formed of rows of white cat's heads, and the headdress was a stiffened white cat's skin. We can't see the bodice or the overskirt in this photo. So thank you, New York Times, for that description, because I couldn't live without that. The head over the forehead of the wearer and the tail pendant behind, a blue ribbon with Puss inscribed on it, from which hung a bell worn around the neck, completed the dress. And the cat is also wearing a ribbon with a little pendant on it. So they're wearing matching necklaces. I cannot, first of all, I cannot imagine putting a taxidermy cat on my head, let alone multiple. Yes. But she went for it, man.
I think my very macabre question is, where did the cats come from? And how many cats were harmed in the making of this dress?
Yeah, did these cats die naturally? Is this the inspiration for Cruella de Vil? I don't know.
She's the cat version of Cruella de Vil. It's very unusual. I mean, I agree. I can't imagine walking around with a taxidermy cat on my head. Hers is definitely the most maybe creative, like you said, but I think most people who attended, you know, they dressed as characters out of literature, or, you know, they would dress as like famous figures from history, so like Marie Antoinette or things like that. So the cat was an unusual choice. I did see someone dressed as like a bee. Someone chose a bee, which okay, but yeah. So I think go ahead.
I think there was a peacock. I read an account of a phoenix. So like animals were other inspirations. So, but man, she went for it with the cat headdress. she was all in.
Alonna, did you get a chance to look at the photo album? Do you have a favorite?
No, I actually did not get a chance to see the photo album, but I did see the picture of the cat costume. And I am a self-described cat lady myself, but I don't think I would take it that far.
That is fair.
Thank God that the Vanderbilts, Alva had a photographer there at the party to document all these costumes. Like, I am grateful for her efforts and for the descriptions, doing God's work here so that we can see what was going on.
That is a good point. Yeah, I don't know how common it would have been to have a photographer there, and they kind of had a photography studio almost set up, because you can see in the photographs there people are kind of sitting in like a photo set. A lot of forethought on Alva's part to say people are going to want to see this after the fact.
And they have a souvenir for people. I imagine people were getting photos from the party that they could keep and keep going.
So I think this is a good place to throw it to a viewer question. We got a question on Instagram from BRGR84 asking, did anything particularly wild happen at these all-night balls all the way to the morning, which we saw? Bertha's ball went way into the morning. Marion's not walking across the street until the sun is up. And then there's a follow-up question of who supervised these events well into the morning. So it's like, if the costumes don't give you enough of a hint of how crazy these things could get, I found a couple of other examples of some wild parties described in the press. We've talked about Mamie Fish and her particular proclivity for throwing really interesting and odd parties. I found mention of a party that was done indoors, but all of the guests were on horseback. And they were carrying around, all of them had individual bottles of champagne in their saddlebags, and they were just living it up on horseback. I don't know how any of that works or what the inspiration behind that was. But there's also Ward McAllister was responsible for a couple of wild parties in his day. He threw a massive New Year's ball in January 1890. He held it at the Metropolitan Opera House, invited 1,200 people, so a similar number. But there were concerns on the part of the police about the alcohol that was being served. There was an ordinance in New York City at that time that you basically couldn't serve alcohol at a public gathering after 1 a.m. And so there were a lot of debates back and forth whether or not this party constituted a public event. In the end, Ward and his compatriots won out in their argument that it was a private event. And so the press reported the next day that wine flowed from sunset to sunrise. So they did not get cut off at 1 a.m. But I think this is such an interesting aspect of this society life, because as we've talked about, there are so many rules in Victorian Gilded Age society about propriety and being well-to-do. And you're not supposed to do, Alonna, what you said, you're not supposed to cry in public, you're not supposed to get sloppy or drunk or like any of those things. And yet they're throwing these wild bashes and no one's blinking an eye that they're staying out until 6 a.m. Like, what do you guys make of that? Because I think it's such an interesting contradiction in a way.
I'm not sure what to make of that. I don't know who's supervising. Clearly Ada and Agnes go home early. So it seems the young people maybe are staying out a little later than others. I don't know. I guess it's like shaking off. First of all, these are people who have money and privilege. So they make the rules and then they break them when they want to. There's not the consequences for them like there would be for Bridget and Jack if they were staying out until 1 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. So I guess that's what I make of it, is sort of they made the rules, they break the rules, they play with the rules. I don't know.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Melanie about that. Just that whole idea, if they made the rules, they can break the rules.
Right.
And I also believe that, I'm sure that there were some, older, people in society that probably hung around to make sure things were in order.
Yeah.
But I also do believe that it was one of those situations where it's like, yeah, do what you want as long as you don't get caught. You know what I mean? I really believe that as long as you don't get caught. And as long as, like, for instance, when Marion came walking across the street after break of day,
Yeah.
you don't look disheveled, I think you're fine.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. There's that unspoken thing of like, we won't talk about it necessarily. We won't get into it. Speaking about who is supervising, one of the things that I was thinking about, and, I don't know that they were necessarily in a supervisory role, but the other side of the coin, you have, the Russells, they're throwing this bash until 6 a.m. What that does for the staff, like what that means for their domestic staff, that means that church and, all of these people who are working, they're also up until 6 a.m. They're not getting to go home because the party is still going on. And sort of the impact that would have on the staff, I think that would be kind of miserable to have to work someone else's party until 6 a.m. And then, go to sleep yourself. So
they probably didn't, right?
Yeah,
Because they had to serve breakfast, they had to clean up, they're packing up the chairs in the morning, they're sending out all that rental stuff. And Bertha's party was tame compared to Alva Vanderbilt's party. If you read the articles from the New York Times, they describe, and first of all, she invited them in advance to promote the party.
Yes.
But the walls were completely covered in greenery and flowers. It looked like a full-on garden. So, Bertha has a lot of flowers, but it's not reaching those levels. So interesting. And how did we get here? Oh, who was dressing Bertha? You were talking about the staff. And I was like, she doesn't have a ladies' maid. She's getting full ball dressed. Is she using this, the maid that Gladys sort of promoted? Who was helping? I didn't notice.
That's a good question. Yeah. Turner just sort of disappears off the face of the earth, obviously. I really thought we were going to get something else from her. Maybe she'll be back in season 2, but that's a great question. Bertha is not getting into that dress on her own. I did love that moment where she's trying on her dress, she's doing her fitting, and she mentions that it comes from Paris, and she's, which is exactly what Rebecca Kelly was talking about with where these sort of dresses were coming from. But yeah, I guess I guess there are other housemaids and other women that are working in the house that perhaps would step in and help her get dressed. But I think that's a good point. Like, how is she getting into this getup? And I think, that's speaking of the decorations and things, I had read some numbers on the cost of Alva's ball. One figure that I had seen, that it was $250,000 in 1883 money, which is several $million in today's money that she is spending on this party alone. And I thought it was important to point out that this extravagance was not without its detractors. There was talk in the press, and there was a strong reaction against this degree of extravagance. There's a lot of coverage in the press about it and sort of saying how, glamorous and stuff, but there were a lot of people that were pointing to this excess and saying that it was inappropriate, which I think most of us would probably agree. That's ridiculous to spend that much money on a party. So, we talk about oftentimes these extremes in the Gilded Age. And I think that it's important to point out at the time that there were reactions against this at the time. It wasn't just everybody was just eating it up and loving to, to hear about it. Which brings me to another question that we had from another viewer. I got an email from a viewer, Liz, all the way in Seattle, who asked us a question about debutante balls. She wanted to know a little bit more about the origins of debutante balls. And she asked if it was inspired by the aristocratic young ladies in Britain being presented to the monarch. That's the first part of her question, which we can talk about. The short answer is yes, it's coming from a European tradition. We have talked about the fact that Gilded Age wealthy Americans are pulling a lot from Europe, a lot from aristocracy, particularly French and British. They are looking to them as examples. And so that's absolutely where the idea of a debutante ball or a coming out for a young lady comes from. But debutante balls, cotillions, also have very long, deep roots in the United States, particularly in the South. So it's a really long history of this idea of young women being presented to society. Initially it's this idea that they're being presented to society, and the announcement is kind of being made that they are ready to get married, and it's a little bit part matchmaker, part party, getting women in front of eligible bachelors. But Liz had another question, which I thought was a really good one, which was she had done some research into Black cotillion balls. For Black Americans, she had found origins in the South in the 1890s, but she was wondering about, how common that was. I've done a little bit of research about it. That it's a fascinating history, because just as much as a deep history there is for white debutante balls, there's a long standing and really important traditions for Black Americans doing the same thing. Alonna, I'm seeing you nod, so I'm going to turn it over to you and let you tell us what you know.
Yeah, so Black cotillion balls, they have actually existed since the late 1700s in the United States. And of course, these were in the early days, you had to obviously be free in order to throw these balls, participate in these balls. And they were usually thrown after that by, Black upper class organizations or upper class Black society members, and they were popular, of course, in cities that had larger African American populations. So I think Liz had asked, did this happen in New York? It absolutely did. In the book Black Gotham by the historian Carla L. Peterson, and this book was actually mentioned by another one of our viewers a few episodes back, she actually mentions, the author mentions that her great aunt's debutante ball was thrown on March 14th, 1866. And it was so successful and so, popular that, the New York Freedman paper, which was previously known as the New York Globe, which we know about.
There's a connection.
Actually mentioned it. Like, they did this whole article on it and described how lovely it was and how, her great aunt was, presented. And then also here in Pittsburgh, we did have, there were tons of African American balls thrown, mostly in the Hill District, which of course, is one of our most famous neighborhoods, and has had and still has a large African American population. And, same thing, was hosted, by the Black upper class. So again, it wasn't, uncommon at all. And just as a side note, while it was seen as undesirable for Black people to attend white cotillion balls and white balls, whites often did make appearances at African American balls, and for several reasons. Some cases, it was if, a Black organization was trying to raise money and they wanted, philanthropists, they would invite white acquaintances, to basically see, that the upper crust of Black society. And then in some cases, it was a little bit of a spectacle, just to see how, how African Americans did their, their parties. Mm-hmm. So it's still very popular, especially amongst Black sororities. It became more popular actually in the 20th century with Black sororities. And it's something that still goes on all over in, north, south, east, west, all over the United States.
Yeah. It's a really fascinating, I think, tradition, like I said, that reaches all the way back to kind of the origins of the United States. It is still done today. My husband has participated in cotillions. It's still a thing that happens, and has a really long tradition. So, it's a little bit different than what we saw Gladys do. Obviously Gladys is basically having a party for herself. She's coming out in that moment, which I think was a little bit more common. That was the form that was more common for these wealthy Gilded Age Americans. We've talked about Helen Clay Frick having her debut. Mr. Frick wanted her to do it in New York. They were living in New York at that point. He wanted it to be in New York. Helen is the one that insisted on doing it in Clayton at home in Pittsburgh. Whereas, I think modern cotillions are, it's usually a group thing. There are multiple women who are debuting at the same time. And it's more of a group organization that's doing it. But yeah, it's a really long, fascinating history. I would encourage anyone who wants to go down a deep dive to go down a deep dive. It's really interesting.
Kelsie, you mentioned Helen's debut taking place in Pittsburgh, and I'm thinking about the fact that she used her mother to kind of help her orchestrate all of that. And they together came up with a scheme to have some invitations produced, and they sent Henry Clay Frick an invitation to Helen's debut in Pittsburgh, maybe without his approval. And it had me thinking about some of the things we were talking about in this episode about girls, daughters, and their mothers.
Yes.
Talking about the different storylines.
Yes, that is a beautiful segue, Melanie, to our last thing that we did want to talk about, because there are some really fantastic moments of mother-daughter duos or mother-daughter-like duos in this episode. And I thought it was a really appropriate place for us to end, because I was, thinking back to our very first episode, we talked a lot about 19th century womanhood and the challenges of being a woman in this period. And it felt really full circle to come back to that conversation within the context of these mother-daughter relationships that we see. We can start, by talking about this interesting comparison between Bertha and Mrs. Astor, and the way that their relationships with their daughters play out on screen in this episode. Alonna, I know you made the point, you felt like it was a really interesting thing to see these two women who were at odds in much of this season, but clearly what they have in common is that they really would do anything for their daughters. And that's really what we see play out in the back and forth that they have in this episode.
Yeah, you definitely saw that when both Carrie and, Gladys at different points were upset with their mothers. Their mothers knew like how far they could go. It was like, do I really want to, be here with her angry, locked in her room, taking her lunch in her room, not wanting to sit with me, or, can I, allow her to, indulge in this, very special thing, just, this one time, even if it's at, my own risk or, so
yeah.
I saw that. And I when Bertha and Mrs. Astor, were having that little chit chat, at the ball where, Mrs. Astor's like, I could, I could easily destroy you after this. And Bertha's like, no, you wouldn't do that because we're too much alike. Yeah. I saw that. And that was the first thing that, I thought about. I was just like, yeah, they're very much alike. And like, they know their limits. And they know how far they will go with their daughters, because really their daughters are like their best friends. You know what I mean? They're little, I don't want to say they're miniature versions, because both of the girls are kind of like, they're different, I think they're a little softer than their mothers,
Sure.
But I think they're the moms, their tenacity, that comes with age and wisdom. So
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, they aren't there yet, but they definitely, you can see that genuine love, that genuine respect that they had for their daughters, and they knew like when to, quarter hills and call it quits with all the extra stuff.
Yeah. And I think it really does speak to that conversation of Victorian womanhood, because motherhood was so tied up in that. The conversation of what's expected of a woman, motherhood goes hand in hand. And there was this idea that a woman, one of her main roles in life was to be a mother, was to have children and raise them. That was a role that I think most women who are mothers take very, very seriously. We see that with Bertha and Caroline Astor. And, you see them, like you said, being willing to do anything. And it reminded me of the conversation that we had with Trudy Cox from the Newport Mansions. She put a little bit of a different spin on this idea of these overbearing mothers in this time period, that it was about more than just the status or, wanting to be married to a duke or whoever. It really does, in a way, if you want to look at it this way, come from a desire to set their daughters up for success, because there are not that many options for them. And that was something that a mother would have really wanted to take an active role in, to make sure that their daughters, like Gladys or Carrie, end up with the right people, end up set up for life so that they can, be taken care of and can live a full life, which we see, play out. But we also see it with Peggy and Dorothy in this episode, which I think is one of the best parts of the episode, watching them come to terms with this news that Arthur has lied to both of them, which we all suspected. I think we all thought that might be the case. But it turns out that Peggy's son is alive. And so Dorothy and Peggy coming together in that moment to defy Arthur in a lot of ways, to go after their motherhood and their grandmotherhood, I thought was a really poignant way for that storyline to wrap up for this season, at least. I thought that was really interesting. Alonna, you pointed out something interesting in terms of Peggy's storyline too, with this idea of if she is successful in finding her son, which, now we get, hopefully, fingers crossed, we're going to get to see some Dorothy and Peggy in Philadelphia on their adventure. But if she does find her son, that's going to make her a single mother. And I thought, Alonna, you had some really interesting insights into what that would really mean for Peggy, because single motherhood is a very different thing in the Gilded Age than the type of motherhood that, say, Bertha or Caroline Astor are contending with.
Yeah. So, as a whole, single motherhood is, looked down upon during this time. Even if you were widowed, you were expected to marry again, and you're expected to marry someone who could, support your household. So, it was no different, for Black women, that expectation during that time. But Peggy, unfortunately, being both Black and a single mother, faces a lot more than societal judgment. She faces, possible life of poverty, lack of resources, to care for her child, unless her parents step in to support her. She also may have to give up her job at the Globe.
Right.
That's another thing. Even employers looked at this, whether or not you were married during this time. And then another issue is that most women who were single mothers during this time, they had to, take 2 or 3 jobs, just to make ends meet. And for a lot of Black women, this meant working as domestic workers and not being able to achieve jobs, that they truly desired. Another, unfortunate consequence was that, once they, had their child, and, even if they managed to take care of them, these children would often start school late due to being, having to help their mother. And they also left school a lot earlier. Many of them did not complete school. And so what that did was that caused not only a disadvantage for that family at that time, but also for generations to come.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I mean, and yeah, I think, we've talked a lot about the challenges that Peggy has faced in this season already. So I think that's an important thing to think about, of what this choice, will do for her path going forward. Obviously, she has every right to want her child back. And, Arthur clearly is in the wrong here, even though he doesn't believe that he is, which I think is another interesting thing. Yeah. Like, Melanie, I have thoughts on Arthur and his whole piece in this?
I loved, certainly from a modern lens where we think that this is wrong. Peggy obviously thinks it's wrong. It's a terrible situation, but I loved his intent, which was for her benefit, and how well acted the scene was when he's talking about, if you're going to do this, but I will not help ruin you. And how steadfast he is in that, his belief that he's doing the right thing for his daughter. Obviously, we would rather see her have a choice and to have kept her marriage and kept her baby, but he truly thought he was doing the best thing to set her up for her future. And he, the care that he has for her that comes through in the acting, that moment was just, that scene was incredible.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And I think it speaks to, from Arthur's perspective, he not only believes that he's doing the right thing, he believes that he's justified in the choice that he's made. there's a point where he says something about, it being his house and his family. That's, on the other side of the coin of Victorian womanhood, there's Victorian masculinity. And that sort of speaks to that, this idea of being the head of the household, being the one who's going to make choices like that for your family, being the protector of the family. So Arthur believes that he is operating within his rights to do that. What's interesting, I think, is watching Dorothy's position shift. And again, I think it plays out in a way that really speaks to this idea of Victorian motherhood, which is being a mother in this period means to be the pillar and the backbone of your home, and to be the moral compass of your home. And what we've seen Dorothy's storyline be in this whole season is her wanting to get her family back together. We see her say that a lot, that she wants peace between Arthur and Peggy. She wants Peggy to come home and be back with their family. But we finally get to that point where the line has been drawn in the sand, and she now is firmly on Peggy's side, even though she says she's not taking sides, or that she's always been on Peggy's side. We see her reach that point where, now there's this grandchild involved, and so all bets are off. And Dorothy is willing to take that step. So yeah, I love that scene of him coming home and they're packing their bags. And they're like, we're getting out of here, we have something to go do. So it's such a interesting and really, I agree with you, beautifully acted scene. The last relationship that I want to talk about just a little bit is not a true mother-daughter relationship, but it has sort of come to be that, I think, in a lot of ways, which is the relationship between Ada and Marion. And if you want to talk about beautiful acting, I think Cynthia Nixon knocked it out of the park in this episode. I think she has quietly become everyone's favorite character.
The progression from the first episode
yeah.
to the last episode has been so different and
yep.
so well done.
Yeah. So, and she really takes on that role of being Marion's guiding light in a lot of ways in this episode, and they have some really beautiful scenes together. But in particular, I do really like that last scene that we see after Marion comes home at the crack of dawn. And it kind of plays into that idea that we were talking about with possibility and change, because she tells Marion, you're in this amazing city. There's so many people you don't even know yet. Like, don't let this thing that has happened with Tom Rakes discourage you, because the world is your oyster basically, and you're going to come back from it. So I also love Ada in that moment, kind of stepping into that motherly role. And I love that Agnes never knows anything.
Yeah, I absolutely love that balance between Agnes and Ada. You have Agnes, the authoritarian,
yeah,
and then you have, Ada, who's, she's sweetness, but
yeah.
she's also, she's not blind, and she lets us know that, as these episodes progress, she lets us know that I am very much aware.
So. Yeah, the slow reveal of what
yeah.
she really does know about the world, and then
yeah,
taking on this role that she didn't get to have throughout her life. You talked about the importance of becoming a mother and being a mother in Victorian in a Victorian woman's expectations, and so she's able to step into this role through the situation that has happened with her brother and Marion coming to New York. So she gets to experience that for the first time.
Right.
She does it well with the light hand.
She does, and I think that kind of speaks to Agnes a lot of the time underestimates Ada, I think, because she never married, she never have children of her own. So Agnes does sort of in some ways put this innocence on Ada, like Ada doesn't know what's going on. And I think Ada has proven time and time again that she is watching, she suffers no fools, and she knows exactly what is going on at all times, sometimes more than Agnes does, because I think Ada is actually sitting back and observing and watching and seeing what's going on. So she's actually more in tune with what's happening around her than maybe Agnes is.
It's the quiet ones you got to watch out for.
Exactly. Well, this has been so fun. It has been such a a crazy ride for us here at the Frick to do this show. I cannot believe that the first season is over. It's hard to believe that we're not going to be back again next week talking about an episode of the Gilded Age. But I did want to stop for a moment and just thank all of the viewers who have found us through this show, who have supported the show on YouTube and on Instagram and all of those things. We're so grateful to you. It's been so much fun. We've been loving watching the dialogue happen, and we hope it doesn't stop. I also want to say thank you to all of our participants, Alonna and Melanie, but also everyone who's been on an episode in the last 9 weeks, both inside of the Frick and from other institutions. We're so appreciative for you to take the time out to be part of the conversation. We're sad to have to take a break, but we are excited that there will be season 2. I read recently that they start filming in May, so maybe we will have a season 2 sooner than we imagine. But of course, in the meantime, you can follow the Frick on Instagram at FrickPGH. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, because there may or may not be some surprise bonus content coming your way. Because while HBO's The Gilded Age is over for now, it is Gilded Age all the time at the Frick. We don't take a break from the Gilded Age. So don't miss it. Keep your subscription so that you will see those episodes drop as soon as they are available. Keep your eye on this space. But until then, thank you so much for watching.